For thousands of years, we told stories around fires. Stories of where our people came from, the great journeys our ancestors took, the lands they conquered and crossed. These tales were woven into our cultures, passed down through generations, treated as sacred truth. But here's the stunning reality. Most of these stories were wrong. Not because our ancestors were liars, but because the true history of human migration was hidden in a place no one thought to look. It was written in the most intimate code imaginable. It was written inside us. Inside every cell of your body, wrapped around proteins in the nucleus, lies a molecule that has traveled farther than any explorer, crossed more oceans than any ship, and witnessed more of human history than any archive. DNA doesn't just carry the blueprint of who you are in this moment. It carries the fingerprint of an odyssey that began over 300,000 years ago, when our species first emerged in Africa. And only in the last few decades have scientists learned to read this ancient narrative encoded in our genes. What they've discovered has completely rewritten the story of humanity. The revolution began not in a laboratory, but in a graveyard. In 1997, a team of German scientists did something that had never been done before. They extracted DNA from Neanderthal remains that had been buried for 40,000 years. The DNA was fragmented, degraded, contaminated with bacteria and fungi, barely recognizable as genetic material anymore. It was like trying to reconstruct an entire library from a handful of burned pages, scattered across a desert. But these scientists didn't give up. Using pioneering techniques that seemed impossible at the time, they recovered sequences of this ancient genetic code. And when they compared it to modern human DNA, they made a discovery that shook the entire scientific world. Neanderthals and modern humans weren't just different species that occasionally overlapped. They had interbred. They had created children together. This revelation opened a door that can never be closed. If Neanderthals had mated with our ancestors, then their DNA was still inside us. Somewhere in the genetic code of billions of living people today, fragments of Neanderthal DNA persisted, like hidden messages from a parallel version of humanity that had vanished into the deep past. Scientists began searching for these fragments with intense focus. And what they found transformed our understanding of human migration, evolution, and the true story of where we come from. Between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. A small group of humans, perhaps no more than a few thousand individuals, began leaving Africa. They weren't fleeing famine or disaster. They were explorers. They were driven by the same impulse that would later send Columbus across the Atlantic and astronauts to the moon, the irresistible human desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. These ancient adventurers didn't have maps, ships, or compasses. They had only courage, curiosity, and an intuition that there was a wider world to discover. And they possessed something else, something that would only be understood millennia later, DNA that would eventually reveal their exact roots to their descendants. For decades, archaeologists pieced together the human migration story through fossils, stone tools, and cave paintings. The evidence suggested that humans spread out across the world in waves, gradually populating every continent except Antarctica. But this method of investigation had severe limitations. It revealed where humans lived, but not always when, or why, or how different populations interacted. The timeline remained fuzzy, filled with gaps and contradictions. Then, in the early 2000s, scientists began applying a revolutionary new technique. They started extracting and sequencing the complete genomes of ancient humans. They could now read the entire genetic history of people who had died thousands of years ago. The findings were astonishing. They revealed that human migration wasn't a simple story of waves moving outward from Africa in neat, linear patterns. It was far more complex, messier, and infinitely more fascinating. Populations moved forward and then retreated. They mixed with mysterious populations that seemed to disappear, actually didn't vanish at all. They simply mixed so completely with newcomers that they became invisible to conventional analysis. But ancient DNA could see them, hidden inside the genomes of modern people like ghosts in a machine. One of the most stunning revelations came from studying ancient DNA extracted from a young boy who lived in Siberia approximately 24,000 years ago. His remains had been found in a remote location, preserved in permafrost, the deep frozen earth that acts as a perfect natural freezer for biological material. When scientists sequenced his entire genome, they discovered something extraordinary. His DNA belonged to a population that had remained isolated in Siberia for over 20,000 years. During that vast span of time, his ancestors had evolved unique adaptations to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But here was the shocking part. This young Siberian boy's DNA proved that after thousands of years of isolation, his people eventually spread outward. Their descendants moved east, crossing a land bridge into what is now Alaska and North America. The genetic evidence showed that nearly every Native American alive today carries ancestry from this Siberian population. This wasn't just a fascinating historical fact. It was a complete overhaul of how we understood the peopling of the Americas. For over a century, archaeologists had debated whether humans arrived in North America 15,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. The genetic timeline extracted from ancient DNA pushed the date even further back, suggesting that the first arrivals may have come over 25,000 years ago, possibly during a brief window when glaciers retreated enough to allow passage. These early explorers crossed into an entirely unknown continent and gradually spread south, adapting to jungles and mountains and coastal regions, evolving into hundreds of distinct cultures and languages. All of this adaptation and diversification was written into their DNA. But the story of human migration revealed by ancient DNA is even more intricate than a simple push outward from Africa. Scientists began discovering evidence of backflow, of returning. Humans, and the findings are remarkable. Some Neanderthal genes that persist in modern humans appear to influence how our immune systems function. Others affect our metabolism and our susceptibility to certain diseases. We are not purely modern humans. We are hybrids, carry the genetic legacy of extinct species written into our very physiology. The process of extracting and sequencing ancient DNA is one of the most demanding scientific endeavors ever attempted. When an organism dies, its DNA immediately begins to degrade. Bacteria and fungi colonize the remains, inserting their own DNA and damaging the target sequences. Chemical reactions alter the genetic code. Over thousands of years, a genome that once contained 3 billion base pairs of information becomes scattered fragments, the longest pieces often just dozens or hundreds of base pairs long. It's like trying to reconstruct a massive encyclopedia from tiny shreds of paper, many of them burned. The breakthrough came in the late 1980s when researchers realized they could use a technique called DNA amplification to create billions of copies from tiny, degraded fragments. By the mid-1990s, a method called shotgun sequencing allowed scientists to tackle entire ancient genomes. They would break the ancient DNA into tiny pieces, sequence each piece separately, and then use computers to reconstruct the original genome by finding overlaps between pieces, assembling them like a three-dimensional puzzle. Contamination remained a constant nightmare. A single cell from a scientist's skin could ruin an entire sample. Working with ancient DNA required the development of specialized clean laboratories, procedures so rigorous that they mirrored the protocols used to handle biological weapons. The stakes were just as high, because a contaminated sequence could lead an entire field of research down a false path. One scientist who became obsessed with perfecting these techniques was Svante Pääbo of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Pääbo had an unusual background for a geneticist. He was adopted and had always been curious about his own origins. This personal drive pushed him to tackle seemingly impossible problems. In the early 2000s, when many scientists believed that retrieving DNA from remains older than a few thousand years was futile, Pääbo announced that he had successfully sequenced a large portion of the Neanderthal genome. The scientific community was skeptical. Some experts suggested his work must be contaminated. Others argued that even if he had truly recovered Neanderthal DNA, it would be so fragmented and damaged that it would be useless for understanding Neanderthal genetics or human history. Pääbo refused to accept these criticisms. He assembled a team of the most talented geneticists and mathematicians he could find and began a project that would take a decade to complete, sequencing the entire Neanderthal genome. By 2010, his team announced that they had succeeded. They had recovered the complete genetic sequence of a female Neanderthal who had lived over 38,000 years ago. When they compared this ancient genome to the genomes of modern humans, the evidence of interbreeding jumped off the screens of their computers. Around 1 to 4% of the DNA in every non-African human today came directly from Neanderthals. This percentage might sound small, but it represented tens of millions of base pairs of genetic instruction, inherited from a species that most people believed we never interbred with. Pääbo's work opened a window into a hidden history of human interaction. The implications rippled outward into fields far beyond genetics. Anthropologists who had built entire career theories on the idea that modern humans and Neanderthals never mixed were forced to reconsider everything. Archaeologists began re-examining fossil sites where the remains of modern humans and Neanderthals were found in close proximity, wondering if they had discovered evidence of communities living together. Evolutionary biologists proposed new theories about why Neanderthals went extinct if they were successfully reproducing with modern humans. The answer, it turned out, was that they did successfully reproduce with us, but not successfully enough. The populations were too small, the mixing was too limited, and within a few thousand years, Neanderthals vanished completely, their genetic legacy surviving only in the DNA of non-African modern humans. As ancient DNA research expanded, scientists began applying these techniques to human remains across the world. Every ancient genome recovered told stories that had been hidden for millennia. DNA extracted from people who lived in the Denisova cave in Siberia revealed a population so distinct that scientists initially thought it must be a new species. The Denisovans, as they became known, had split off from the modern human lineage over 500,000 years ago, yet they had migrated far enough to encounter an interbreed with modern humans in Southeast Asia. Today, people from Melanesia, the Philippines, and other Southeast Asian regions carry up to 7% Denisovan DNA. Scientists have identified specific Denisovan genes in these populations that appear to enhance the ability to function at high altitude. This is not coincidental. It suggests that when modern humans migrated to regions in the Himalayas and other high elevation areas, the Denisovan genes they had inherited gave them a survival advantage. The more scientists sequenced ancient genomes, the more they realized that human populations across the world had been far more interconnected in prehistory than anyone had imagined. DNA evidence revealed that populations in the Caucasus region, who had left no written records and little archaeological evidence, had mixed with populations from at least 3 different directions. People from Eastern Europe moved south and east, people from the Middle East moved north, and people from Central Asia moved west. The genetic evidence shows these populations colliding, mixing, creating new cultures, and spreading farther. Some genetic lineages persisted for tens of thousands of years before vanishing. Others became dominant, eventually giving rise to entire civilizations. In Africa itself, DNA has revealed migrations and mixing events that completely contradicted traditional theories. Scientists found evidence that there were not one, but multiple periods when human populations spread north from Africa to the Middle East. And in at least one case, populations from the Middle East and Europe migrated back into Africa. These return migrations had been invisible in the fossil record, leaving no archaeological traces. But they were unmistakably written in African DNA. It's as if our species possessed an instinct to explore and disperse, but also an instinct to return and reconnect, a pattern that would repeat throughout human prehistory. The timeline of human migration revealed by ancient DNA also contradicted many long-held assumptions about human capability and courage. Our ancestors didn't have the technology or knowledge that later explorers possessed. They didn't have ships that could reliably cross oceans or maps that showed them where they were going. Yet the genetic evidence proves they made ocean crossings. People migrated from Southeast Asia to Australia over 50,000 years ago, crossing water gaps that required them to be out of sight of land, demonstrating navigation skills and seafaring courage that was almost incomprehensible for people with such primitive technology. The DNA of Australian Aboriginal people today carries unique mutations found nowhere else on Earth, evidence that they have remained isolated for over 50,000 years, one of the longest sustained isolated populations in human history. In the Pacific Ocean, ancient DNA has revealed the incredible saga of Polynesian expansion. Around 3,000 years ago, people began migrating east from Southeast Asia into the vast Pacific, settling island after island across millions of square miles of ocean. They possessed remarkable navigational abilities, reading stars and waves and weather patterns to find remote islands separated by hundreds of miles of open water. The genetic evidence shows this expansion happened in multiple waves, with populations from different regions mixing and splitting, sometimes moving backwards to recolonize previously populated islands. The DNA of modern Polynesians carries markers that allow scientists to track these ancient voyages with remarkable precision, pinpointing which islands were settled from which direction and when. Perhaps most remarkably, ancient DNA has allowed scientists to begin answering questions about human culture and behavior. In prehistory, by sequencing the genomes of individuals who had died thousands of years ago, researchers could determine whether certain populations had genetic adaptations to particular environments or foods. They discovered that people who had lived with dairy farming for thousands of years had evolved the ability to digest lactose into adulthood, an adaptation that spread rapidly through European populations as farming became the dominant way of life. Other populations that relied on hunting and gathering evolved different metabolic adaptations. These genetic changes happened not over millions of years, but over just a few thousand years, evidence that human evolution didn't stop when civilization began. We are still evolving, still adapting, still shaped by our environments and our choices. The implications of ancient DNA for understanding modern human diversity are profound. We now know that the concept of distinct human races, a theory that had been used to justify everything from slavery to genocide, had no basis in biology. All humans are far more genetically similar to each other than any two individuals of the same race are likely to be similar to each other. What we call racial categories are superficial, arbitrary, and biologically meaningless. Yet genetic variation does exist across populations, and much of that variation tells the story of ancient migrations, adaptations, and mixing events. Understanding these genetic differences is not about ranking populations or suggesting superiority. It's about understanding our shared history and the diverse paths that brought each of us to this moment. As ancient DNA research has expanded, it has also raised profound ethical questions. Whose permission should scientists need to extract DNA from ancient remains? Do indigenous peoples have rights to the remains of their ancestors? Should ancient DNA be used to determine which modern populations have legitimate claims to ancestral lands? These populations are descendants of migrations that happened long after other populations first arrived. These findings can complicate political claims and cultural narratives, raising uncomfortable questions about the nature of indigenous identity and historical ownership. Scientists have begun partnering with indigenous communities to conduct ancient DNA research in ways that respect cultural traditions and community sovereignty. Some communities have welcomed genetic research as a way to reclaim their own history and validate their oral traditions. Others have rejected it, viewing the extraction and analysis of ancient human remains as a violation of spiritual beliefs. This tension reflects a larger truth. Science is not conducted in a vacuum. It happens within societies with their own histories, politics, and power dynamics. The process of extracting and studying ancient DNA is never purely objective. It reflects the values, questions, and assumptions of the scientists conducting the research. Yet the rewards of this research have been extraordinary. Ancient DNA has given us the ability to read the autobiography of our species written in genetic code. We now know with remarkable precision when different populations split off from common ancestors. We can identify the exact moment when modern humans first encountered Neanderthals, when Polynesians began their Pacific expansion, when Indo-European peoples migrated into Europe. We can see the genetic footprints of population mixing events that happened tens of thousands of years ago, events that shaped the very foundation of human diversity. And in doing so, we have learned something humbling. We are all migrants. Every single one of us descends from ancestors who left their homes, crossed oceans, adapted to new climates, encountered strangers, and created new cultures. Migration is not a modern phenomenon or a recent human behavior. It is written into our fundamental nature as a species. Looking ahead, ancient DNA research is poised to reveal even more secrets about our past. Scientists are developing techniques that will allow them to extract and sequence DNA from remains that have been buried for millions of years, potentially revealing the genetic evolution of human ancestors over unimaginable timescales. They are also refining methods that will allow them to identify the genes responsible for specific traits and behaviors, gradually building a genetic map of human cognition and capability. Some researchers are even exploring the possibility of using ancient DNA to understand how populations adapted to climate changes in the past, knowledge that might prove crucial as we face unprecedented climate challenges in the future. The story written in our DNA is far from complete. Every year, new ancient genomes are recovered, new populations are discovered, new migration routes are revealed. And each discovery adds another layer of complexity and beauty to the portrait of human history. We now understand that we are not the products of isolated development, but of constant interaction. We are not genetically pure, but beautifully hybrid. We are not the culmination of evolution, but creatures still in the midst of change. The DNA that flows through our bodies carries the memories of millions of years of human struggle, exploration, adaptation, and connection. It tells us where we came from, and perhaps, if we listen closely enough, it whispers suggestions about where we might be going. In unlocking the secrets of ancient DNA, we have begun to understand the greatest mystery of all, ourselves.